All right. So, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning for, I think this is our first webinar of the 2024-25 school year season. So, we're kicking it off with a conversation around family engagement and STEM or STEAM. And so we appreciate all of you being here. This webinar is made possible by funding through the Million Girl Moonshot and STEM Next Opportunity Grant. So we're grateful for those funding resources. And we are welcoming Bernie, who is going to share his vast knowledge and insight with all of you around engaging families in STEM opportunities. So Bernie, I'm going to hand it off to you to introduce yourself.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And hi again, everyone. As Jennifer mentioned, I'm Bernie Traversari. I am a STEM education consultant with WASTA. But prior to my current role, I was the Director of Science Outreach at Edgewood College in Madison. And my primary job there was to create family-centric STEAM opportunities for engagement with the community. So we had a couple of projects running both in Madison and Milwaukee that worked with a lot of schools and community centers where we got to design engaging interactive activities for families to participate in. So I am happy to share some of the knowledge from that experience today, and also to go through this new toolkit that I was able to design for WASTA, and hopefully a toolkit that you'll be able to use on your own, and that will be of use for your own programs. Okay, so this is how the presentation is going to work. The toolkit section is going to go by in a sort of very repetitive fashion, so please stop me at whatever point you like. And then also, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to just raise your hand or chime in, and I'd be happy to stop and then answer those questions as we go along. Okay. So the first thing that I wanted to cover before actually diving into the toolkit is one of the main questions that I usually get when I talk about family-centric STEAM engagement, right? And this question has to do with whether family engagement is different than student engagement, or how those two things relate to one another. And what I like to say is that family-centric STEAM engagement is really student-centric STEAM engagement with a focus on family or familial networks, right? So when we design programs that work with the entirety of a family or familial network, what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a support network for students so that they can build their STEM identity and feel more comfortable in participating in STEM-based activities, right? We know from research and past studies that the more we can build a STEM identity, the more likely it is for students to remain engaged in STEM and potentially pursue higher education and a career in STEM. So that's really what we're trying to do here, where we're talking about family engagement, is we're trying to build that support network, and we're trying to get students to develop that STEAM identity through those programs. So it's not about working independently with students and then independently with parents or caregivers. We want to have both of those groups together as a part of these programs. And then another question that I usually get when I talk about this toolkit or family engagement programming is whether parents even want this, right? Do caregivers want to be involved in STEAM education? Do they want to be involved in their kids' education at all? Or do they want their kids to just do things in the classroom or in their own out of school time engagement programs? And then for parents to be sort of like a backstage supporting player in that process. And I would imagine that for a lot of you, you know the answer to this. The answer is yes. Parents do want to be involved in STEM education and other aspects of their kids' education. But the caveat here is that parents really don't know how to best do that, right? The gap in knowledge and how to become involved in those engagement opportunities, how to be involved in their kids' education, that's where the issue is. So, and that's not surprising, because any type of engagement is difficult. Any type of supporting role that parents want to take is sometimes confusing, right, with their kids' education. And that's particularly true for STEM. STEM is difficult. STEM is difficult to teach. STEM is difficult to create engaging, interactive opportunities around. And it really takes a community-wide process to bring parents into the fold and to really have them be key players as a part of their kids' education. And so the purpose of this toolkit is really to create those community-wide opportunities to be able to identify all of those stakeholders that can and should come together so that parents and caregivers can participate in some of these opportunities as well. And what are some of the best practices surrounding that process? That's really what the central theme of this toolkit will be about. Okay, so the toolkit itself is not something that was developed by WASTA independently, right? This is a toolkit that will focus on the CARE framework, which is a family engagement toolkit that it was developed by the Institute for the Study of Resilience in Youth, or ISRI, that is affiliated with Harvard University, and the STEM Next Opportunity Fund. So there is already a lot of research and past studies and application examples that went into developing this framework. And so what I attempted to do with the toolkit instead was to break down the framework, which contains a lot of really useful information. And I encourage everyone, if you have the time, to read through all of it. But to break it down into its main component, and then to explain what the goal of each component is, what are some of the key ideas behind each component, and then also what are some real world examples as how you may apply those components for your own programs. Something that we did this past year with WAST is we participated, or we developed a few family engagement programs with local community partners in Milwaukee using specifically this framework. So all of the examples that I'm going to provide were utilized as a part of those projects. So they are real world examples that also included some key differences between project partners, so as to reflect that the variety of ways that this framework can be applied. Okay, so again, this is really a simplified version of the CARE framework, and the way that the rest of the presentation is going to go, I'm going to go through each of these individual components, and as I'm going through them, again, please feel free to stop me, ask questions if you have them. I don't want this to become a super repetitive process where folks are just listening in and kind of tuning out as we're going through each of the independent components. Any questions so far about the presentation or what the toolkit will be about?
So Bernie, if I can interrupt for just 1 second, I did put in the chat that the toolkit will be housed on the WASTA website for you to access. And I also want to mention that this CARE framework is also on the WASTA website, is linked there. So you can look at the full document, and then you can also have access to the toolkit that Bernie's going to walk through. So I just wanted to make mention of that.
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, so what are the partners that we worked with as a part of the development of this toolkit, right? So I mentioned the real world examples that I'm going to be going through. And for those, we actually developed 2 different programs throughout the past school year where we apply the CARE framework and we try to find ways to be creative about that. And so I think it's important to mention this because both projects had specific differences between one another, but we were still able to apply the CARE framework for both. So I think it's a good way to showcase how you can utilize this and this framework in a variety of different situations and environments. So one of the projects that we designed was a series of family engagement nights with a focus on math education with Stellar Elementary, which is part of the Carmen Schools of Science and Technology. We developed these 3 family engagement nights with the assistance of Dr. Gabriela Pinter from UW-Milwaukee's mathematics department. And then we were able to fund all of these nights with a $1,500 grant from the Wisconsin Society for Science Teachers. So this was a relatively small grant that allowed us to get materials, that allowed us to purchase food for families as a part of all of these events, and in some cases, even provide transportation for families if they needed it. Stellar was not in a position to fund any component of these nights on their own. So it was really important for us to be able to get some external funding in order for the project to happen. So those $1,500 went almost equally into each of those 3 nights with stellar families. And then the other project that we developed was, again, similarly, a series of family engagement nights with a focus on math education with Dr. Gabriela Pinter. But this time we worked with Milwaukee Public Schools through their Javits Grant program. And rather than working individually with just one school as a part of MPS, we instead utilized the Javits Grant program as a way to reach a number of different schools and then get participation from families from all of those schools together. So, so we were able to kind of bring in families from a number of different schools, number of different backgrounds to come together and participate in math education. We also did that not in a central MPS location. Instead, we partnered with MSOE's STEM Center. That's where we held all of our events with MPS, which was really useful because then families felt like they had a central meeting location to go to, rather than having to go to their own MPS school or a different MPS school. In contrast with Stellar, where everything took place at Stellar Elementary. For our project with MPS, we really didn't have any funding other than some limited funding from the Javits Grant program, but we were able to find ways around that in order to either recycle materials from some of our other nights with Stellar Elementary, or to create activities with pre-existing materials that Dr. Gabriela Pinter had or some of her colleagues had at UWM. So again, had to find ways to be creative, but that was kind of the point of going with these 2 projects and seeing how we could apply the care framework independently for each. And just wanted to make sure that, okay, no questions, perfect. Okay, so last thing I'll mention before going to each component of that framework, and that I think is useful to say, is whether this toolkit, whether this framework is useful at all, right? There are a number of different toolkits and resources and materials that you'll find online for family engagement, specifically family engagement in STEAM. And so I think it's always good to showcase evidence of this being a useful thing for you to implement with your own programs. And so in the way of evidence, at least for our projects and the use of this particular toolkit, I included a very brief graph with information from some of our own post-family engagement surveys that we handed out both for Stellar Elementary and MPS throughout the past academic year. And one of the questions that we ask on the post survey and also the pre-event survey was whether parents felt confident in their ability to help their kids learn math, right? And we measured the difference between those 2 results after the events were done. And we saw a more than 10% increase in the affirmative. So we, at the end of all of our events, whether families had attended all of the events or only one event, we saw that they became more confident in their abilities to help their kids learn math, which is important, right? We don't know how this is going to translate directly into classroom grades, for example, but we do know that parents at least will take advantage of these opportunities in the future, and they'll also be more willing to look for additional resources for their kids or just be there for their kids as they're going through their own struggles with math education. So I thought it was important to mention this because even in that short time frame, even those small number of events that we were able to put out throughout the year, we saw this important increase in confidence in parents and other caregivers. So that tells me that toolkit is useful, is a good way to develop these type of programs. Any questions about this as well before we move on? Okay, great. So now we're going to go into each of these individual components from the care framework. Again, what I'll do is I'll go through the main goal and through some of the key ideas, and then how we implemented or how we tackled each of those key ideas through the 2 projects. So the first component of the framework is the connect component. And the goal here is to build positive relationships by fostering an inclusive and collaborative community amongst all of your stakeholders when you're designing a family engagement program, right? This includes parents, caregivers, school staff, school administrators, external partners, volunteers, the students themselves, right? You want to be able to create that collaborative community. And one of those first or key ideas behind that is invitation, right? So the first step in any process of designing a family engagement program is to reach who you want to partner with, reach those diverse families and staff in a way that is going to welcome them in an inclusive manner to the project. Okay. And for us, for instance, one of the ways that we tackle that is we realize that in working with Stellar Elementary and also a good portion of the MPS schools that we were partnering with, we had to attempt to at least have a second, we had to attempt to invite families whose first language was not English, and create materials that attempted to at least tackle one different language other than English. It would have been great if we could have done more than one. But for us, the priority was Spanish, right? So we wanted to make sure that we invited families whose first language was not English into the project. And the way that we achieved that was by creating flyers in both English and Spanish. This is an example on the right here of the flyers that we created with very simple information about the project, what it was about, who was going to lead it, where it was located, how to register, the different dates for the project. And then we translated that from English to Spanish and shared it with families. And I know this seems like a small thing in the grand scheme of designing your program, but just being able to provide this resource to families, specifically at Stellar Elementary, where more than 90% of the families are Hispanic or Spanish speaking, really increased the number of families attending each of the events significantly. I think when we first send out our flyers in English, we got maybe 2 or 3 families. Then we send out our Spanish flyers and we got 8 to 9 new families to participate in the project. So that is how you attempt to create an inclusive environment and invite the families and caregivers that you want to reach into your project. And this is not the only way to do that. You can also host family nights at the school to tell folks about the project or program or event, and have a translator be there helping you with direct translations for those families. You can send out emails. You can reach families through social media, which has become fairly common. That's something that we used to do quite a lot when I was still at Edgewood College. So there's a number of ways to do that. But again, the goal is to think of creative ways to reach that diverse audience that you want to target, and to take into consideration some of those key differences like dual language or primary or not English speaking families that you want to have participate in your program. Any questions about this? Okay, so continuing with Connect, the other key idea here is belonging. So in addition to inviting people into your program, event, or project, you also want to nurture the connections within all the different stakeholders in your community, right? In your ecosystem. And that for me at least means going beyond just highlighting whose responsibility it is to develop the program, to lead the activities, to invite the families, to be in charge of the kids, right? It's not just a matter of delineating responsibilities across those different stakeholders, but really creating positive connections amongst all of them. And this might feel like it's not necessarily super useful for those first few events, but it creates a sense of sustainability for the future. So if you are successful with the first few events, like we were with Stellar or MPS, and we see families wanting to do more in the future, then having those those positive connections already developed will allow you to easily continue to do that into the future, into the next academic year. So for instance, for us, one of the things we did to build those positive connections is really just spend time with some of the key partners in our project, and also some of the key volunteers that assisted with a lot of our events. So I included a few pictures of those key stakeholders, key volunteers here on the right. On the first picture to the left, there's myself with some of our external project partners, including Dr. Martha Lopez from the MPS Javits program all the way to the right. Dr. Lopez was incredible in finding resources, money, ways to connect with families within MPS, reaching out to all of those individual schools to get families involved. Without her, it would have been really difficult to wrangle all of the different schools that were participating in the project. And so having that connection with Dr. Lopez allowed us to attract all of the families and caregivers that we wanted to work with. Without her, that likely wouldn't have been possible. And then on the second picture to the right, I showcase a number of UWM architecture students that volunteered for our MPS math nights, and also to some extent with our Stellar math nights. And these students, along with students from UWM's actuarial club, were really the secret sauce in making sure that the events flowed in a really positive way for everyone involved. They allowed us to put families into different groups so that they could do each of the activities that we had prepared for them. It allowed us to kind of have control over the room when families were participating in those events, and to answer questions without having just one of us moving around each of the tables or moving around each of the groups that we had designed for the activities. And then it also just allowed us to take care of some of those elements that we had forgotten about. So if we needed to go find more materials, or we needed to go get more food, we could ask some of the volunteers to do that. And it allowed us to remain in the room with the families and not just leave them alone as we had to go and solve those other issues. So it was really the secret sauce, and having all of these volunteers be able to participate in the events that allowed those events to be successful. And I realized that finding volunteers is not an easy task, but again, it's developing that close relationship with volunteers that that should be a part of you designing these programs so that they are successful. Any other questions? And I'm going to repeat that every time I go through one of these. Okay, so the next core element of the framework is the ACT portion. And for this, the goal of ACT is to engage everyone who is a part of your program, so youth, family, staff, in activities that are hands-on with regards to STEM, and that help foster a growth mindset, okay? And the first key idea here is STEM practices. So this has to do with providing opportunities for anyone who participates in your program to not only practice skills that are relevant to STEM, but also apply those skills and apply the knowledge gained through those activities together. So when you're talking about families, you really want to create opportunities where everyone is learning from one another. It's not just the caregivers or parents looking at their kids participate in an activity and then kind of asking them questions or kind of supporting them in that process, right? And also not having just the caregivers or parents do their own thing with their kids in a separate room without those two groups seeing one another, okay? And really is about creating ways for them to be together, to participate in those activities independently, and to learn from one another. So for instance, what we did for all of our activities with both Stellar and MPS is we separated the parents and caregivers from the kids, kept them in the same room, but separated them all together. We created groups of parents and caregivers and groups of kids, and then had them all do different activities. And then we rotated everyone within the same room across those different activities. So at the end of the night, everyone had done all of the same activities, and they also get to see each other engage in those same activities throughout the entirety of the night. For instance, one of the activities that we created was this really fun mace mat that's actually not created by us, but it's part of the Julia Robinson Math Festival. It's pictured here on the right. The goal is to go from the top left corner of the mat to the X by following a series of rules on how you can move across the mat. And at one point of the night, we had one group of kids attempting to do one of the mats and one group of parents and caregivers attempting to do another of the mats. So these two mats are different configurations. And it was really great because you could see the kids looking at their parents, at the caregivers, trying to attempt and trying to go through this difficult process in the same way that they were going through that difficult process. So they realized a couple of things. One, we're not the only ones struggling with math. This is difficult for anyone with any age group. And two, everyone is having fun with this. So you can see the parents and caregivers laughing while the kids are laughing. And so it creates that common sense of, oh, we're going through this together. It's not just us kids having a difficult time with math. Parents, caregivers also have a time with math, but they find a way to make it work. And that was sort of the theme of all of the nights, is the parents and the kids being able to see each other struggle in the same way, enjoy themselves in the same way. And so if you can create those opportunities within your own events, it really adds to that growth mindset that you can achieve. And it really makes the events a lot more interactive and less of a task for parents or caregivers to just be an extra thing for their kids to do. It has to become something where everyone's learning together. Any questions about this first key idea? And I'll mention as well that we use other activities from the Julia Robinson Math Festival in addition to the Mace Mat. I mention it because the Julia Robinson Math Festival has a lot of really cool things that you can utilize, and those are ready to go activities that you can implement at any time. Okay, so in a similar fashion, the other key idea within ACT is STEM everywhere. So after you create your interactive hands-on activities that you've done with everyone in the same room, or all of your participants within your events, the other portion of this is to promote those STEM activities, or to promote STEM anywhere at any time, right? And so this is thinking about long-term. After your attendees have participated in your events, after you've engaged with families, how are you going to make sure that they continue to talk about STEM outside of the event space, outside of the classroom, and to at least promote those conversations? And there's many different ways to do this. You can create reading clubs, you can create opportunities to just talk with families outside of class. But for us, what we attempted to do was create take-home kits for families to continue to engage in math in a fun way while they're at home. And all of these kits reflected the same math themes that we had through each of the nights. So whether that was math sense or number sense or pattern recognition, right? We wanted to replicate those within the math kits, within the take-home kits. And we gave these to families to take home and to continue to engage with on their own. And pictured here on the right are just a few of the games that we included. Sleeping Queens is a really fun game, not super expensive to purchase. It's all about pattern recognition and number sense and simple math, addition and subtraction. We also included Spot It, which is it's a much more pattern recognition heavy game, but a lot of fun too. And then we included a bag of dice as well. And we included some worksheets with that bag of dice for families to play dice-based games, and also to do some magic with dice, so dice magic, which a lot of families enjoyed. So by promoting this, we were able to ensure that families will continue to do STEM outside of our confined environment and outside of our very clear, directions and controlled setting. And we actually got a lot of positive feedback from families telling us, for instance, that their kids would come grab one of those kits and ask their parents to play the games with them, right? So it wasn't about the parents having to push their kids to use the take-home kits or having to pressure them to play the games. It was actually the other way around. The kids were asking the parents to participate. And again, that creates that common sense of, oh, we're learning this together, we're participating in this together, we're creating the supportive environment for math education. And you can do this with any topic within STEM, not just math. Okay, any questions as well? No, cool. Okay, so the next element or the next component of the framework is reflect. And this, I think, is one of the most difficult components of the framework to implement, mostly because we tend to forget about reflection. after we come up with a STEM-based activity or STEM-based programs for families or for students or for anyone, right? And the goal here is to use some reflective practices to improve learning and to really create that sense of continuous learning amongst youth, families, and staff. So it's thinking about the future, but also thinking about how to improve for the future and make sure that if families are enjoying the activities you're creating for them, that you're making those activities better and that they're continuing to add to the family STEM education and to the kids' STEM education in a positive way. And the first key idea here is meaning making, right? So creating space for families to reflect jointed together and to deepen their STEM learning. And again, many different ways to do this. But one of the ways that we attempted to do that in our family nights throughout the last academic year was to take advantage of the shared space where families were participating in their own independent activities in. And at the end of the night, after everyone had gone through each of the activities we had prepared for them, and the kids and the caregivers had seen each other participate in those activities, we took 10 to 15 minutes to have everyone in the same room just tell us about their experience, right? We wanted to hear from both the caregivers and the kids at the same time, and wanted to see if their experiences were the same, were different, were positive, were negative. We encouraged them to be very honest. If they absolutely hated the activities, we encouraged them to tell us that. And I know it sounds like a small amount of time, but just doing that gave us so much good information to use for all of the follow-up events that we had throughout the year. And it was really interesting too, because we saw kids offering their own perspectives at the same time as their parents or caregivers were offering their perspectives as well. So it didn't become a situation where parents were the ones talking and kids would just be listening, but everyone was sharing their experience. And I think that was a result of us preparing the activities so everyone participated in them together. But again, being able to create this space for shared learning and shared reflection was really useful for us. And I think it was really useful for the families as well, in seeing that this was actually a positive experience for everyone who was involved, not just the kids and not just the caregivers. So being able to create that space is really important. Okay. And in the same way, you also want to find resources or ways to achieve continuous learning. So this is the second key idea within Reflect. And this is really just about finding ways to continuously listen and learn with families. And again, that can take shape in a number of different manners. You can create a series of meetings with families that had participated in your events throughout the academic year. You can meet with them a couple of times after each of the events. You can send them, emails. But one of the ways that we found was really easy to do was through those surveys that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. We decided that we wanted to obtain some very simple information from families, both before and after each of our events, to see if that learning process was present, and to make sure that we took into consideration any comments, feedback that the families had into our subsequent events. So on the right here are the exact same surveys that we utilize for both our pre and post events, event situations. Most of these were on a Likert scale, so very easy to complete. The parents would just rate all the questions, all the statements from 1 to 5. And then for our post-event survey, the only difference we had was a space for feedback for families. So if they wanted to include any notes or comments or questions, they could do that through this space. But this was something really easy for them to do. It took them maybe 2 to 3 minutes to complete. So it wasn't a lot of time taken out of our events. And it provided us with a lot of really useful information. And similarly to the flyers that we created to encourage recruitment of families for the events, we also had the surveys in both English and Spanish, so that it was easy for families to fill out, especially if those families were predominantly Spanish speaking. So this was a really easy way to attain this continuous learning, and we hope to continue to refine these and to use them in other settings as well. Okay. Any questions on reflect and the two key ideas here? No? Okay. And so the last component of the care framework is empower. And I mentioned that I think reflect is the most difficult portion of the care framework because we tend to forget about reflection most of the time. But I think the most complicated to implement is actually empower. And the goal behind empower is to inspire everyone who's involved in your events and your programs to shape those events, to shape those experiences along with you, and to help design some of the ways that they can continue to pursue STEM learning and potentially STEM education into the future. Okay, so it's really about almost letting go of the steering wheel and designing some of these events and giving that power to the families that you want to be involved in those events, or to the students or anyone else, right? And that is something that is oftentimes difficult to do. And so the first key idea here is voice. So if you want to attempt to do this, the first thing that you can do is to just create pathways for everyone who's involved, for caregivers, families, students, to lead and decide what to do. And this doesn't necessarily have to be giving everyone full authority to design the events and you just take a step back and see what happens. It's almost about letting them be able to make small decisions at the beginning and continuously build it up to more major decisions or bigger decisions as a part of your programs. And again, this can be in a lot of different ways. It can be about letting families decide when during the year you should prepare your events. Doesn't need to be at the beginning of the academic year, end of the academic year, middle of the semester. What works best for families? What are some of the times that work best for families? Are there any specific holidays throughout the year that they think would be good to attract other families and to help create more engagement, right? So it's about being able to create those opportunities for families to give you some feedback and to kind of let them decide what these events should look like. And so one of the ways that we did it, that we attempted to create a space for voice and for sharing of potential decision making was at the beginning of each of our events, especially with our Stellar Elementary families. We hosted a dinner with everyone. So before we even dove into the math, before we even explained what we were going to do, we offered everyone who was in attendance food and we chatted with them for about 20 to 30 minutes prior to each of the events. For Hispanic families, this is really important because meal sharing is important in Hispanic culture and it creates an opportunity for everyone to just chat in an informal manner and share their opinions and perspectives. But as each of our events went along, if we had recurrent families, we sort of created this opportunity through dinner to chat with those recurrent families and say, hey, what do you think we should do next time? What do you think might be an interesting activity for your kids or your friends who you seem to have brought with you for them to participate in during our next event, right? And we took those ideas into consideration and we implemented a lot of them, right? We sometimes took out activities that families told us might not be super interested and try to implement others. Or we switched the dynamics of the group such that we created more multilingual groups rather than separating caregivers and students amongst English and Spanish speakers because we thought that was going to be more effective at the beginning, right? So they eventually were able to decide what would be best based on their past experiences. And while this didn't affect the overall planning of the nights, it did allow us to make some important changes. And so being able to create that space for voice was really important for us. Okay. And then similarly, for the second idea here, it's navigation. So helping families negotiate and advocate for their children through a variety of different ways. So even if they're not able to make decisions within the events you're creating because of logistical constraints or whatnot, or maybe there's no space for them to do so, you still want to help them find ways to make decisions on their own STEM education and their kids' STEM education through other means. And this doesn't necessarily mean, tell them to go and design their own events and figure out their own, logistics for their events, but rather give them opportunities for them to say, oh, maybe we'll go as a family to this museum on this day to participate in this one community event that's taking place, right? It's really about empowering them to say, there's all these other opportunities available. We're gonna consciously take advantage of those opportunities and create ways to continue to engage with STEM as a family, right? Outside of the events that you're potentially designing with the school. And so one of the ways that we achieve this, I think, successfully during our events is by creating these groups of caregivers that participate in the activities on their own, I think we inadvertently created groups of friends, and groups of adults who just wanted to spend time together with other adults, which we forget is difficult to do when you have other responsibilities. And ultimately, what that led to was the adults kind of chatting with each other and saying, "Hey, we know there's these other activities taking place within the next few months. Why don't we get our kids together and go to them as a group?" Right? This was a really fun thing to do as a family, and we enjoy doing it with other families. So why not do it in other settings and taking advantage of these other opportunities together? And this was really great, and it made us think about how we can utilize this setting and these groups in much more effective ways into the future, specifically within the empower component of the framework. But at least for our events, it allowed for an opportunity for families to make their own decisions about what to do moving forward, and to also share those decisions and even make those decisions together with other families that participated in our events. So again, being able to include these opportunities for empowerment is really important, but I do recognize that logistically it's sometimes difficult to implement. Okay, so that was the last component of the CARE framework. Any questions so far? Okay, so as we're kind of winding down to the end of this presentation, there's a few more things that I wanted to mention. And one of those things is that even though the CARE framework is fantastic, and I personally have implemented it in the past, and I implemented it this past year, and this toolkit is meant to be a summary version of that framework, this is not meant to be the end-all be-all of toolkits or resources for family engagement, okay? The idea is for you to utilize this toolkit as you see fit, as it works and for you and helps you design your own activities, but you should complement it with other things and other resources that you find and that you think might be useful for your particular situation. I know that WASA, we are adding some of these resources to the website as we speak and as we go through some of these workshops, because we believe all of these complement one another. So really, this toolkit is meant to be the first step in helping you design your own family engagement activities, but it's not meant to be the end-all be-all. And you should certainly complement it with other resources. And another thing that I wanted to mention is that there are many different components to the CARE framework, right? There's those 4 main components and then key ideas within each component. And it's okay if when you start designing some of your events, some of your projects, some of your activities, you don't tackle all of these components at the same time, because it is quite a big task. I attempted to do that this year with the 2 projects that I was working on, because I had experience working with the CARE framework in the past, and I wanted to be able to utilize all of it. But when I first started using the CARE framework, I found that I could only really focus on one thing at a time. And maybe it was connecting, maybe it was achieving that level of connection with stakeholders and families in a positive way, and to be able to invite them into the events that I was designing. And I couldn't really worry about all those other frameworks. And then when I got good at it, and when I was able to connect and to properly engage families in STEM activities, then I can focus my energies on reflection and thinking, well, how am I going to get useful information from these events for future events? So don't worry about meeting all components at the same time. Take them one at a time and build on them as you continue to build your programming. Okay, For the sake of time, I won't really go through this slide. This is available on the website. The entire toolkit is available on the WASTA website, but it includes a list of potential, obstacles that may appear as you're designing your own events. These are based on some of the obstacles that we found as we were designing our own events this past academic year, and potential solutions, simply as a way to showcase how you can be creative and work around some of those obstacles as needed. Okay, and then the last thing I'll mention is that if you are looking to design your own STEAM-based family engagement programs and are having a difficult time doing so or want some additional assistance, you can request that additional assistance through WASTA through their technical assistance webpage. I've included the link here, and also you can just take a picture of the QR code that is included on the toolkit, which will take you directly to that technical assistance request site. Okay. So that is it for me in terms of presentation, which is great because I wanted to leave at least 10 minutes for questions. And then Jennifer, I don't know if you've mentioned this to the rest of the group, but next week, same time on Monday, we'll have a second webinar that will focus on the toolkit itself, but it'll be, rather than going through the presentation again, it'll be an opportunity for folks to just come together and talk about programs, events, activities that they're wanting to develop with families or already in the process of developing, and it'll really be more of a workshop for us to chat about those projects and to offer help and assistance as needed. And we've also designed a worksheet for that, which we can share in the chat in just a second that folks can use.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Bernie. So when you registered for today's event, hopefully you saw that there were 2 meeting dates, so this Monday and next Monday, and I will send a follow-up email to everybody where I'll share a form for you to kind of start thinking about some family nights that you may want to host. And next week, we will really spend time having conversations and processing and talking and thinking about some of this. And Bernie will be on hand to help provide some resources and support if you're thinking through some ideas and maybe are stuck somewhere. We have Bertie with quite a bit of experience to help you think about how you might navigate some of the challenges that you are thinking about when you're doing some planning for some family nights. So we'll leave some space for questions. Does anyone have any questions? And I'm actually going to stop the recording here while we take a little bit of time to chat.